All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving headfirst into a legal battle that's escalated all the way to the Supreme Court.
To the highest court in the land.
And we're talking about the Corporate Transparency Act.
Now, you might be thinking this is just a bunch of boring legal jargon, but trust me, this thing is packed with enough drama to rival your favorite courtroom thriller.
So, the Corporate Transparency Act, it was passed in 2021.
Right.
And the idea was pretty simple, at least on the surface.
Hmm.
Make businesses come clean about who actually owns and controls them.
Yeah.
They wanted to stop those, criminals who use, like, shell companies to launder money, or even worse, fund terrorism.
Yeah.
Transparency is usually a good thing, right?
It is, especially when you're trying to prevent those serious financial crimes.
But how this law was written, it stirred up a hornet's nest of controversy.
It did.
And naturally, some businesses, they were not exactly thrilled at having to reveal all their secrets. So they took their grievances to court, a Texas court to be precise.
Mm-hmm.
They filed a lawsuit arguing that this entire act is unconstitutional.
And this is where things get really fascinating.
Okay.
U.S. District Judge Amos Mazan sided with the businesses
Really?
and issued a nationwide injunction
Hold on.
completely blocking the law from going into effect.
Nationwide.
Yeah.
So one judge in Texas
Yeah.
can just stop a federal law.
Well, that's the power of a nationwide injunction. It's essentially a legal sledgehammer that can halt a law in its tracks, and I mean across all 50 states. But, as you might imagine, giving that kind of authority to a single judge has ignited this firestorm of debate about whether or not it's actually fair, whether it undermines the whole system of checks and balances that we have in our government.
Right. So it's not just about this one law, it's about the power of the judiciary. I see why the government wouldn't be too happy about this. What did they do?
Well, they did what any of us would do in a situation where we felt strongly that something was wrong. They appealed.
Okay.
They took the case all the way to the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court. Wow.
And they argued that this injunction was absolutely crippling their ability to fight financial crime.
Right.
And they said it was potentially jeopardizing national security.
I mean, imagine trying to track down these criminals hiding behind these shadowy shell companies when you can't even figure out who is actually in control.
It'd be a nightmare, like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Exactly. I was reading that the government also used this case to try and make a bigger point about nationwide injunctions in general. Like, they were using this specific case to try and change how those injunctions are used in the future.
Oh, absolutely. They saw this as an opportunity to address what they see as a growing issue.
Okay.
Nationwide injunctions have been getting more and more common in recent years, and that leads to situations where you've got judges in different states issuing these conflicting rulings, and you end up with this patchwork of laws across the country, right?
Yeah, talk about confusing. So they were playing a bit of legal chess, using this case about the Corporate Transparency Act to maybe reshape the whole legal landscape when it comes to these injunctions.
Exactly. It's a brilliant strategy if you think about it.
Pretty smart. Pretty smart. But what about the businesses? What were their arguments against this law? I mean, what were they so afraid of?
Well, their main point was that forcing them to reveal this private information about their owners is a massive government overreach. They said it could violate their First Amendment rights, their freedom of association, and their Fourth Amendment rights, protecting them from unreasonable searches.
So they're basically saying that making them disclose this ownership information is like forcing them to reveal their personal connections and
Yeah.
that the government is snooping around where it shouldn't be.
Precisely. They framed it as an invasion of privacy,
Wow.
a significant intrusion into their private affairs.
And did they have any other arguments?
Oh, yes. They also said that complying with this law would cost businesses billions of dollars.
Billions with a B.
With a B. It would be a huge financial burden, they argued.
So we've got this epic clash, the government arguing for security and businesses fighting for privacy and economic freedom. It's like a classic legal dilemma with no easy answers. This is fascinating.
Absolutely.
But before we get into what the Supreme Court ultimately decided to do, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with part 2 of our deep dive into the Corporate Transparency Act. All right, so we're back, and we're picking up right where we left off.
Yep. With this heated legal battle over the Corporate Transparency Act.
The government wants it to fight financial crime. Businesses are pushing back hard, saying it violates their privacy and is way too expensive.
Right, a real clash of values.
But before we get to the Supreme Court's decision, I want to circle back to this whole nationwide injunction thing. It sounds like a seriously powerful legal tool.
It is. It really is. Imagine a normal injunction, right?
Okay.
It's like shutting down a single road,
Yeah.
maybe because of construction or an accident.
Okay, yeah, I get that.
But a nationwide injunction, it's like shutting down the entire interstate highway system.
Whoa, that's a pretty dramatic analogy.
But that's the kind of impact it has.
Yeah.
One judge can effectively halt a law across the entire country.
I can see why that's controversial.
Oh, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
Critics say it gives way too much power to individual judges. You could have a single judge, maybe with a specific political agenda, basically overruling Congress and the president, putting a law on ice for the entire country.
Yeah, that doesn't seem very balanced.
Oh.
What if you get judges in different states issuing these nationwide injunctions that contradict each other?
Sure.
It would be total chaos.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a huge concern. The potential for inconsistency and uncertainty in the legal system.
Yeah.
Imagine being a business owner. You don't even know which laws apply to you. How can you comply if you don't know what the rules are?
Right, it would be impossible. But there must be some arguments in favor of these nationwide injunctions, right?
Or, of course, there are. People who support them say they're a vital tool to protect people from unconstitutional laws.
Yeah.
If a law is truly harmful, they argue, it shouldn't be enforced anywhere while it's being challenged in court.
That makes sense. Why should people in other states have to live under a potentially bad law just because the lawsuit was filed in one particular state?
Precisely. And there's also an argument that nationwide injunctions can actually make the legal process more efficient, prevent a flood of lawsuits in different states all over the same issue. One judge makes a ruling, and everyone saves time and resources.
Okay, so there are valid arguments on both sides. I'm starting to understand why this whole issue is so complicated. It's about finding that right balance, protecting individual rights, ensuring the legal system functions properly, and respecting the whole democratic process.
Exactly. It's a complex equation with a lot of moving parts, and the Supreme Court, they know that. I think this case with the Corporate Transparency Act could be a turning point.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think they're getting ready to address this whole nationwide injunction issue head-on in the future to set some clearer guidelines about how they should be used.
Wow, so this case could change the rules of the game, not just for this one law, but for how all laws are challenged in court. It's a lot bigger than it initially seemed. But for now, let's get back to the Corporate Transparency Act itself. Let's say it survives all these legal challenges. What kind of impact would it actually have in the real world?
Well, first off, it would mean a lot of businesses would have to scramble to start collecting and disclosing information about their owners, something they haven't really had to do before. They have to dig deep and figure out who the beneficial owners are, the people who really control the company, even if their ownership is hidden behind all sorts of complicated corporate structures.
Sounds like a big administrative headache for some companies. But I bet law enforcement would be pretty happy about this, right? Having all this information would be huge for them.
It would be a game changer in their fight against financial crime. It would be much harder for criminals to hide their money and use those shell companies for all their shady dealings.
Yeah, makes sense. But doesn't all this transparency come with some risks? I mean, what's to stop this information from falling into the wrong hands or being misused?
That's a valid concern. The government has said they've put safeguards in place to protect this data, limiting who can see it and making sure it's only used for specific purposes. But you're right, there are always concerns about data breaches, unauthorized access, and the possibility of misuse.
So more transparency can be a good thing, but it's not without its downsides.
Right, it's a trade-off. And it's worth noting that the U.S. is kind of behind on this.
Really?
A lot of other countries have already implemented these types of beneficial ownership transparency requirements. This act would bring the U.S. closer to international standards.
Okay, so we're playing catch-up. But what about the impact on businesses themselves? I mean, beyond all the paperwork and compliance costs, could this actually be good for them?
Potentially, yes. More transparency could help businesses avoid partnering with, shady characters who might be involved in illegal activities. It's about doing your due diligence and knowing who you're dealing with.
So it's not just about catching the bad guys, it's about creating a cleaner, more transparent business environment overall.
Exactly. It levels the playing field and encourages good governance and ethical practices.
So it's a complicated issue with potential benefits and drawbacks. What did the Supreme Court ultimately decide? Did they give the green light to the Corporate Transparency Act or shut it down?
Well, it's not that simple. They didn't actually make a final decision on the law itself. They decided to allow the Corporate Transparency Act to be enforced while it continues to work its way through the lower courts.
So a win for the government, but the fight isn't over.
Not at all. The legal challenges will continue in the Fifth Circuit. They'll take another look at whether the law is constitutional, and whatever they decide could be appealed back up to the Supreme Court.
So we might see round two of this at the Supreme Court down the road.
It's very possible, especially if the Fifth Circuit's decision clashes with what the Supreme Court has already said.
This thing could go back and forth for years. But even this temporary decision from the Supreme Court has to mean something, right? It sends a message, doesn't it?
Absolutely. For now, at least, they're siding with the government's efforts to combat financial crime, even if it means raising concerns about individual rights and the power of these nationwide injunctions.
But didn't some of the justices express concerns about those injunctions?
They did. Justice Neil Gorsuch, even though he voted with the majority, made it clear that he wants to address the nationwide injunction problem more directly in a future case.
Yeah.
He basically said that the Supreme Court needs to set some clearer rules.
So this whole case could be the trigger for the Supreme Court to completely change how these injunctions are used in all kinds of legal battles.
Exactly. It's also important to note that not every justice agreed with the decision to allow the law to be enforced while it's being challenged.
Oh, right.
Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, she dissented. She argued that this case wasn't urgent enough for the Supreme Court to intervene, that the lower courts should handle it.
So even within the Supreme Court, there's disagreement about how to handle these nationwide injunctions and when they should step in. This is all so fascinating. We've got this law aimed at stopping financial crime, but it's ignited this legal battle that's raising fundamental questions about our system of justice and the balance of power in our government. I'm completely hooked.
It really highlights the complexity of these issues.
What happens next?
We've talked a lot about the legal and practical aspects of the Corporate Transparency Act, but there's a whole other layer to explore, the philosophical and ethical questions it raises.
Oh, I love a good philosophical debate. Tell me more.
Well, this law forces us to think about some pretty big questions. How much transparency are we willing to accept in exchange for more security?
Hmm.
Where do we draw the line when it comes to the government's power to collect and use our personal information?
Yeah.
These questions go way beyond this one specific law. They touch on the core of our democracy.
That's a really good point. It's not just about the legal details, it's about our values as a society. We have to find that balance between security and freedom, between transparency and privacy.
Exactly. And those aren't easy balances to strike. It's a conversation we need to keep having.
It's so easy to just focus on the day-to-day headlines and miss the bigger picture. This case is a reminder that even these legal battles can raise profound questions about who we are and what we stand for as a nation.
It's about shaping the kind of future we want.
I'm so glad we had this conversation. It's been eye-opening.
Me too.
Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today, but this deep dive isn't quite over. We'll be right back to wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts to chew on. Welcome back, everyone. It feels like we've gone through this whole legal maze trying to understand the Corporate Transparency Act. Where do we even begin to untangle all of this?
It's definitely been a wild ride, exploring all the ins and outs of this case, from those secretive shell companies to this fundamental question of individual liberty.
Yeah. We've seen how this one law has become like a focal point for this much bigger debate about transparency and privacy, the balance of power in our society. So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways? What do you want our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest thing to take away from this whole case is how difficult it is to balance security and privacy in our world today. Everything's so interconnected now.
Right.
The Corporate Transparency Act, it's just one example of how governments all over the world are grappling with this challenge, how to combat crime and protect national security while also protecting individual rights and freedoms. It's like walking a tightrope.
And this case really shows us how important it is to have citizens who are informed and engaged, willing to think critically about these complex issues.
Absolutely. We can't just leave these decisions to politicians and judges. It's up to all of us to be part of the conversation, to think about the consequences and advocate for solutions that align with our values.
It's not just about, passively following the legal battles. It's about actively shaping the kind of society we want to live in. And this case, as specific as it is, has these implications that reach far beyond the courtroom.
Exactly. It forces us to think about the role of judges, the power of the government, and how we balance individual liberties with collective security.
Mm.
These are questions that we're going to continue grappling with for a long time.
And we can't forget about the Supreme Court and their potential decision about nationwide injunctions.
Right, that could have huge consequences.
It could change how other laws are challenged, how they're put into practice.
This case is far from over.
So, as we leave our listeners to ponder all of this, what's the one big question you'd want them to think about?
Well, here's something to consider. What happens if the Supreme Court decides to limit the use of nationwide injunctions? How will that affect our ability to challenge laws we believe are unconstitutional? Will it make it harder to fight against bad laws while those legal battles drag on? Will it tip the scales in a way that some people see as unfair?
That's a really great question. It makes you realize that this case is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. We have to stay informed, stay engaged, and be ready to participate in shaping a society that is just and equitable for everyone.
I completely agree.
Well, thank you for joining us on this journey. It's been quite a deep dive.
It has. It's always a pleasure to explore these complex topics with you.
And to our listeners, thank you for being here. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep those minds working. Until next time.